My brother managed to land a job thanks to my husband's recommendation, and within weeks he treated the place like his personal shopping mall. We're not talking about sticky notes or pens. He walked off with expensive electronics and somehow thinks no one should be mad about it. For context, my husband Dan manages inventory at a tech hardware company, so this wasn't just a casual slip-up, it was a direct hit to his professional reputation. But here's where it gets wild. My parents are furious, not at him, but at me. And the way they justified it will make you question what family first really means. Family first, unless you're not the favorite. In my family, family first has always had a very specific meaning. Everyone pitches in to save my younger brother Jake, 29M, no matter how reckless his choices, while I, 34F, end up in the role of fixer. It never meant equal support or fairness. It meant my energy, money, and patience were resources on demand. That pattern didn't suddenly appear in adulthood. It was built from the time we were kids. One example still sticks with me. Jake took my bike without asking, rode it straight into a tree, and totaled it because he didn't believe the brakes were important. The fallout, I got punished for not keeping an eye on him, and my allowance was taken to cover the repairs. He, meanwhile, got rewarded with ice cream later that night. That wasn't a one-off event. That was a snapshot of how things always tilted in his favor. School life reinforced it too. When Jake failed math, my parents didn't hire a tutor or hold him accountable. They volunteered me. I'd already had a packed schedule, but suddenly my after-school hours became math lessons with a kid who thought calculators were cheating. My grades slipped as a result, and instead of anyone noticing that I was stretched too thin, I was told I wasn't being a supportive enough sister. That summed up the imbalance. He struggled, I sacrificed, and somehow I still came up short. Looking back, those moments weren't just frustrating, they programmed me to see myself as the backup system. If something broke, if Jake fell behind, if responsibility had to land somewhere, it landed on me. I didn't just learn to expect it, I learned to anticipate it, because letting go meant bracing myself for one of my parents' lectures about being selfish. That same script has followed us into adulthood. Jake has stumbled from one failed job to another, usually blaming bad luck or unfair bosses. Meanwhile, my parents hype him up like he's a misunderstood genius who just needs another break. Never mind that breaks have already come by the dozen. If he struggles with rent, I'm expected to chip in. If a friend cuts him off financially, my parents push me to step up with a temporary loan, which everyone knows translates into giving money I'll never see again. Even when they suggested he move into our home until he got back on track, it was packaged as an opportunity for me to demonstrate compassion. But in reality, it meant extending Jake's streak of zero accountability and giving him access to our refrigerator on an endless loop. When I finally ended that arrangement, my parents didn't scold Jake for coasting. They accused me of being heartless. Their picture of him has never changed. To them, he's fragile, unpredictable glass that might shatter with the slightest nudge. They talk about his failures like they're traumas, framing every misstep as something others should cushion. When I set boundaries, I'm painted as selfish. When I refuse to finance another emergency, I'm accused of putting him in danger, as if my no was a plot to strand him on the side of a highway. The effect on me has been exhausting. Being cast as the reliable one made me view myself less as a sibling and more as a permanent crisis manager. It's not just that I help, it's that I'm expected to fix. And when I refuse to, the guilt trips roll in like clockwork. Even other relatives have noticed. A cousin once joked that if Jake burned down a house, my parents would blame me for not teaching him about fire safety. Everyone laughed, but it wasn't far from the truth. For decades, responsibility has circled back to me, while Jake racks up more new chances. That cycle hasn't stopped evolving, it's just gotten bigger in scale. Jake isn't wrecking bikes anymore, he's losing jobs and living beyond his means as an adult with every advantage. But the response from my parents is the same. If I stumble, I'm criticized. If he stumbles, there's a rescue mission. They've perfected the art of rewriting every crisis into a story where he is misunderstood and I'm cast as the one who needs to step in. And it's exactly that mindset that created the latest escalation. Because when Jake was jobless, again, it wasn't framed as his responsibility to solve. Instead, my parents wanted me to step up once more, but this time in a way that would drag Dan into the mess too. The cousin of nepotism we don't talk about. When my parents floated the idea of Dan bringing Jake into his company, they didn't frame it as a request. They dressed it up with soft words like opportunity and fresh start. What they really meant was, convince your husband to do the heavy lifting we don't want to do anymore. They expected me to push Dan into hiring my brother, as though my marriage and my husband's career were bargaining chips for family loyalty. Dan was very clear about what that meant. Recommending someone for a position at his company wasn't the same thing as giving a friend a ride somewhere. It was him attaching his own name and credibility to Jake. He told me point blank that vouching for an employee is taken seriously, and once you put your reputation on the line, it sticks, whether the person rises to the occasion or drags it through the mud. For someone whose entire job revolves around accountability and detail, the idea of staking that trust on my brother wasn't just risky, it bordered on self-sabotage. There was an irony baked into all of this. Dan is the kind of manager who lives and breathes structure. He plans, he double-checks, he makes sure no one on his team is guessing about expectations. If you had to visualize responsibility in human form, it would practically be him. On the other hand, Jake's version of professionalism is rolling into work after noon and declaring victory if he remembered to bring his phone charger. The gap was so wide you could see it from space. It wasn't just unlikely that Jake would meet Dan's standards. It was almost comical that my parents believed this could work. And that mismatch wasn't invisible to me. I could already see the disaster forming. In my head, I imagined Jake waltzing into the office with yesterday's shirt, brushing off lateness as a traffic miracle, and somehow expecting to be praised for showing up at all. I knew the script. I'd lived through it in different forms for years. The pattern was identical. He promised he'd change. Everyone convinced themselves this was the turning point, and I got stuck dealing with the fallout when it all collapsed. But logic never stood a chance in these conversations. My parents have perfected the art of guilt. They're like two musicians who play in harmony, taking turns striking every note they know will push you closer to giving in. My mom leans on sweeping lines about belief and second chances, drawing out silences like every pause is proof of my heartlessness. My dad follows with blunt appeals to morality. What kind of sister wouldn't help her brother back on his feet? It's not about discussion. It's about cornering you until resistance feels crueler than compliance. Then there was Jake himself. He stood there with that well-rehearsed look of determination, the same one he'd used back in high school when he swore he'd finally handle chores or keep up with homework. He added his predictable promises. This time it would be different. This time he'd step up. This was his chance to prove himself. At 30, you'd expect those words to carry weight only if they were followed by action, but with him they were just recycled lines. He spoke with confidence, like he believed saying it out loud made it true, and somehow my parents treated those empty claims like gospel. From the outside, you'd think anyone would see what was happening. The entire situation looked like the setup for a sitcom, the tightly wound professional husband stuck babysitting the unreliable brother-in-law at work. You could almost hear the laugh track waiting to kick in, but my parents either didn't notice or didn't care. They reframed it as Jake's chance at transformation, his big moment to turn over a new leaf. They invented a story where a job, handed to him rather than earned, would magically rewrite years of the same behavior. Dan, to his credit, kept his composure. He sat there quietly, weighing the risk. Every part of him knew what was at stake. It wasn't just about filling a slot on his team. It was about attaching his name, the name he'd built up for 10 years, to someone who treated responsibility like it was optional. But the corner he found himself in was nearly impossible. Say no, and it looked like he didn't care about supporting family. Say yes, and he took on the weight of my brother's failures before they even happened. It was less of a choice and more of a trap. The pressure didn't come in one sweeping blow. It built gradually, filling every empty gap in the conversation until it felt like there was no air left. That's how my family operates. It's not shouting, it's not obvious threats. It's rope pulled tighter and tighter, covered in soft words about love and duty. That way, if you resist, you're not rejecting a plan, you're rejecting the idea of family itself. And in the end, that's how decisions get made. Not because they're smart, not because they're fair, but because saying no feels unbearable. So Dan agreed, reluctantly, warily, but he agreed. Outsiders looking in might have seen kindness, a successful man lifting up his brother-in-law. On the inside, it felt like stepping onto a track where you already know the train is coming. The optimism my parents wrapped around it, this idea that Jake just needed the chance, was the same story they'd told 100 times before. Hope, effort, failure, the cycle was about to spin again. I could see it, Dan could see it, but no amount of clarity could compete with the fantasy my parents wanted to believe. And that was where things landed. Dan with his reputation tied to someone who never earned trust, my parents satisfied because their golden child had been saved once more, and Jake basking in unearned confidence. As for me, all I could do was wait, because if history had taught me anything, it wasn't a matter of whether the collapse would come, it was only a matter of when. What I didn't expect was how that collapse would begin. For a short while, things didn't look so bad. In fact, the first few weeks were surprisingly calm. And then, just when it almost seemed like Jake might prove us wrong, something happened, caught on camera, that changed everything. The honeymoon period, aka shockingly functional brother. I'll be honest, when Jake actually started the job, the outcome caught us off guard. For once, there weren't immediate disasters or complaints. During those first months, he showed up on time, kept himself presentable, and even gave the impression that he wanted to learn. Compared to his history of skipping obligations and shrugging off responsibility, the contrast was jarring. It wasn't anything extraordinary by normal standards, but for him, it was unusual enough to notice. Dan came home most evenings with quick updates, delivered like field notes from an experiment he didn't fully trust. He clocked in early today. He asked questions instead of standing around. He took notes. Each observation carried that same tone of disbelief, as if Dan was waiting for the other shoe to drop. None of this would raise an eyebrow with a typical new hire, but in the context of Jake, even competence felt like a headline. The very fact that his coworkers weren't rolling their eyes or filing complaints counted as progress. Neutral reactions meant no red flags, and for Jake, that alone was considered noteworthy. He even made it through orientation and daily routines without incident. Following processes, respecting schedules, and engaging at least on a surface level, it looked like he was doing the bare minimum, which for him was already a considerable shift. Instead of constant excuses, there were indicators of effort. Dan remained skeptical, but he admitted that during those weeks, Jake was holding it together. To Dan, it was stability. To me, it was an eerie calm, an unfamiliar version of my brother that I didn't entirely trust. Our parents, of course, absorbed this news the way they always do, as proof that Jake just needed faith and opportunity. Every call from them carried a smug edge laced with comments like, "See, we told you he only needed support," or "He's finally on the right track." They seemed eager to rewrite his history, replacing years of short stints and failures with a single narrative of triumph. My father even described him as finally finding his footing, as though 3 months of steady attendance outweighed a decade of negligence. And maybe because of that pressure, part of me wanted to believe too. I caught myself letting a little hope slip in. What if this was the start of an actual change? What if the responsibility finally stuck? As suspicious as I felt, I couldn't help but imagine how different life would be if Jake really followed through. Watching him survive probation without being sent home felt almost surreal, because the possibility of him turning a corner, however slight, tugged at that reserved corner of hope I'd trained myself to suppress. Still, experience told me otherwise. I'd seen this cycle play out before, the trial version of good behavior that always expires. It's a pattern he perfected, enough initial effort to buy goodwill, then a gradual slide back into shortcuts and excuses. I remembered old relationships where girlfriends praised him in the beginning, only to discover later that the promises didn't hold up. I remembered when he moved in under the guise of getting back on his feet, only to let others cover his bills. The faces and settings changed, but the script never did. This was the honeymoon stretch, steady enough to calm everyone, just impressive enough to give him the image of a reformed man. Even Dan, cautious as he was, softened slightly by the end of probation. He never said he trusted Jake completely, but his tone shifted from watchfulness to cautious approval. Passing the 3-month mark without an issue gave him reason to think maybe, just maybe, this job would be different. He wasn't convinced, but he wanted to be. Meanwhile, Jake leaned into the role of the changed man. He called our parents often, updating them about normal shifts as though each one was evidence of personal growth. "I'm really doing it," he'd say, talking like a person who just discovered the concept of responsibility. They didn't just accept it, they glorified it. My mother repeated his words back like she was recounting inspirational news. My father praised him at Sunday dinner as if reporting on achievements far greater than clocking in at work. Ordinary actions, arriving as scheduled, following orders, not causing friction, became celebrated as monumental victories. From the outside, it might have looked like a small redemption narrative. A man with a checkered past steadies himself thanks to family support and finds his footing. That's exactly how my parents framed it anyway, but beneath it, I felt the tension set in. I couldn't enjoy the calm because I'd lived with it too many times before. The quiet never lasted, not with Jake, and even as everyone praised him, I braced for when his pattern would finally resurface. The atmosphere at home reflected that tension. Every time Dan began with, "So here's how today went," I found myself holding my breath, prepared for the first sign of unraveling. And when his report stayed neutral, the relief was uneasy. Silence didn't reassure me, it made me anticipate the storm building behind the scenes. In most families, no bad news means things are fine. With Jake, no bad news just meant we hadn't discovered the problem yet. Still, I'll admit the act held longer than I expected. Making it through probation at all gave the impression that perhaps his streak of collapses had finally ended. But deep down, I understood what was really happening. This was the setup phase, the act before the slip. The normalcy was thin, constructed, fragile, more like a balance waiting to tip than a new foundation. Because eventually that calm cracked, not with lateness, not with laziness, but with something far bolder. By the time the truth surfaced, it wasn't whispered complaints or subtle issues, it was undeniable proof. The kind of proof you don't hear about secondhand, but see directly with all the clarity that leaves no room for argument. And that hard evidence left no space for excuses. It was security footage, plain, direct, and impossible to explain away. And once that came out, the story of Jake's so-called turnaround shifted fast. The five-finger discount career strategy. The truth behind Jake's sudden downfall wasn't subtle. He was caught on camera trying to leave the building with high-end graphics cards and other electronics stuffed into his backpack, straight out of the locked inventory cage. Management confronted him immediately, and HR didn't hesitate. They terminated him on the spot. In a company where Dan's entire team exists to safeguard valuable equipment, theft isn't a gray area. It's the one line you can't cross. For Dan, the cost of this wasn't just professional embarrassment. Colleagues had trusted his recommendation, and now that trust had been compromised. Worse, the situation could have escalated into a police report and criminal charges worth thousands of dollars. The only reason it didn't come to that was Dan himself. He pulled management aside and convinced them to treat this as a one-time goodwill gesture. No police, no record, just termination and expulsion from the building. That decision preserved Jake's ability to find work in the future, but it cost Dan a piece of his own professional credibility in the process. He extended protection that Jake hadn't earned and didn't even seem to value. Jake, on the other hand, didn't react with alarm or contrition. He didn't freeze in fear over what he had risked, and he didn't seem shocked at the seriousness of it all. Instead, he took the discovery with a kind of bewildering detachment, like being fired for theft was closer to being written up for wearing the wrong shoes. That disconnect became even clearer once he began offering his explanations. His first attempt was that he believed the boxes looked abandoned, as if sealed, barcoded equipment in a locked cage somehow signaled trash. When that fell flat, he pivoted. He admitted he needed money, and desperation drove him to it. That didn't fix anything. All it revealed was that he had willingly decided his paycheck wasn't enough, so the company's property was his backup plan. Neither story held water, but he rotated between them as though one might stick if phrased just right. Dan described the confrontation as surreal. Jake didn't posture aggressively, but he wasn't apologetic either. He carried himself like this was a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right tone. At one point, Jake even suggested he planned to return some of the gear once he figured things out. It was an argument so bold and absurd it almost felt like parody. Borrowing electronics from an employer is not borrowing, it's clear-cut theft. That he spoke these words to a manager who stakes his career on preventing such losses made the moment feel more like a parody sketch than reality. What elevated the absurdity was his casual confidence. He acted as though employees dip into storage all the time, as if it's not a big deal to pocket merchandise worth multiple paychecks. Companies in this sector don't overlook missing stock. Every component that passes through Dan's team is tracked and accounted for with digital logs, barcodes, and cameras. The idea that high-end graphics cards could go missing without anyone noticing was laughable, but Jake clung to it as though imagining it might make it true. Dan bore the brunt of that fallout. Trust in his judgment and the recommendations he made was now under review in every quiet hallway glance. Even though he had done everything possible to handle the matter swiftly, his credibility had been dented by association. He had argued for Jake's hire, vouched for his reliability, and spared him legal trouble when things fell apart. That effort didn't preserve his reputation fully. It only spared Jake from consequences far worse than unemployment. The disconnect only deepened in the days that followed. To Jake, what happened wasn't theft, it was punishment exaggerated out of proportion. He spoke about it like he had simply crossed some unclear boundary, as though being dismissed for stealing was an overreaction by uptight management. The way he painted it, losing the job wasn't his fault, it was the company's rigidness that destroyed his chances. He made himself out as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own firing. And when this version of the story reached our parents, the spin spread faster. Their reaction wasn't anger that Jake had betrayed Dan's trust or stolen from a place that kept him employed. It was outrage that the company had dared to enforce consequences. To them, it was unbelievable that one mistake could end a job so abruptly. They acted like companies in the real world should hand out second and third chances for conduct that anywhere else could involve police. Their ability to absorb Jake's excuses and reshape them into a tale of his mistreatment was both familiar and infuriating. Jake leaned into that sympathy. He played the misunderstood son whose risks had been blown out of proportion. In his version, he wasn't a thief, he was unlucky. He had been too resourceful in the wrong moment, and the company had overreacted. It didn't matter that video footage existed or that Dan had negotiated to keep him from facing criminal charges. In the alternate narrative playing in my parents' living room, he was simply someone who got caught bending the rules and deserved a chance to prove himself again. On paper, the whole saga was predictable. Nepotism hire, brief honeymoon period, catastrophic collapse by committing the one offense no employer can forgive. But in person, it played out far stranger in that Jake never once behaved as though his choices carried lasting weight. That lack of accountability, paired with my parents' willingness to defend it, turned a serious situation into something almost surreal. Instead of recognizing theft for what it was, they called it bad luck, harsh treatment, or misunderstanding. For Dan and me, the incident closed a chapter. Jake had been given an opportunity, squandered it spectacularly, and avoided criminal charges only because of extraordinary lenience. End of story. But in my family's universe, the story was just beginning. Because if the company had committed the sin of letting him go, someone had to step in and fix it. The real confrontation wasn't with Jake anymore, it was with the people who couldn't accept that reality. And that storm made its way to our doorstep next. Parents versus reality, round 1. When the firing became official and word reached my parents, the first calls came within hours. They weren't stunned into silence or asking what happened. They were already angry, already convinced I was at fault, and already demanding action. Their position was simple. I needed to convince Dan to undo the decision and give Jake back his job. The theft itself, the footage, the HR meeting, none of it mattered. What mattered to them was that I wasn't repairing it. The direction of their anger was startling. Instead of calling Jake out for walking off with equipment, they scolded me like I had been the one with electronics stuffed in a backpack. My father's voice hardened right away, zeroing in on Dan. He declared that my husband should protect his own family, by which he meant rehiring Jake. To him, family duty meant bending Dan's career until it snapped. My mother, on the other hand, took the pleading route. She told me I needed to sit Dan down, appeal to his compassion, and beg him to give her son a second chance. The language she used wasn't about fairness or consequences, it was about mercy, as though Dan owed Jake another try simply because of blood ties. I kept trying to bring the conversation back to reality, pointing out that Dan had already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. He hired Jake against his better judgment, he staked his own reputation on recommending him, and he even persuaded management not to involve the police when the theft was discovered. That reprieve protected Jake from a criminal record. Yet when I reminded my parents of that, they brushed it off like it was trivial. They acted as though sparing him from legal trouble was the bare minimum, and the real test now was whether Dan and I would go the extra mile and hand him his old job back. The calls did not stop. My phone filled up with messages, switching between guilt-driven appeals and heated directives. One moment my mother would send a long text about not abandoning your brother in his darkest hour, and the next she'd be calling again, speaking through tears about how this would ruin his future unless I intervened. Then my father would ring, speaking in that commanding tone he always used to end arguments. To him, this wasn't a discussion, it was an obligation. In his eyes, refusing meant turning my back on family loyalty. The roles were stark, Dan as the executioner, me as the person with the power to reverse it, and Jake as the wronged party waiting to be rescued. It didn't stop at words. Both of them showed up at our house, moving their pressure campaign into our living room. They sat me down as though staging a formal family meeting, poised between dramatic appeals and accusations. My mother's refrain was that this was about forgiveness, as if theft was a personal slight you could hug away rather than a violation of workplace trust. She spoke slowly, with deliberate emphasis, testing every angle of sympathy. My father interrupted her often, correcting my responses with statements about what family does, as though quoting from some unwritten law. Every sentence reinforced their belief that the real failure was Jake stealing. It was me refusing to erase the consequences. I could feel myself being pulled back into the role I'd occupied since childhood, the fixer. They framed it exactly that way. This was my chance to step up, to show loyalty, to prove I wasn't just looking after myself. But no matter how they phrased it, the line was the same. Dan had to take Jake back, and it was my job to make that happen. Every attempt I made to explain the seriousness of workplace theft, every reminder that Dan's entire career was on the line, slid past them. They didn't debate the facts, they redefined them. Jake's actions were minimized, Dan's refusal was dramatized as cruelty, and my reluctance was treated like betrayal. I thought emphasizing Dan's perspective might break through. I reminded them that recommending Jake had already strained his standing with management, and that pulling strings after a theft would shred what was left of his credibility. Instead of taking that in, my father leaned forward and said, "If Dan really cares about this family, he'll take the hit." The hit, that was his word for it, as though jeopardizing a career and sacrificing professional integrity were routine prices for kinship. To him, protecting Jake was proof of love, even if it set fire to everything else. Meanwhile, my mother kept circling back to the idea of a second chance. She insisted that everyone makes mistakes, that all Jake needed was one more opportunity to show his growth. I had to remind myself that she wasn't talking about tardiness or carelessness, she was talking about attempted theft from a locked inventory cage. But in her universe, the difference didn't register. She spoke as though Jake had missed a curfew, not nearly brought police into the company. Her plan was simple. I was supposed to appeal to Dan's heart, explain how hard life had been for Jake, and beg him to let it go. Their persistence turned absurd quickly. At one point, they told me that if roles were reversed, they would move mountains to help me. But their comparisons didn't make sense because I'd never been caught stealing from an employer, never put them in the position of asking someone else to gamble their career on me. They lumped together normal family support with this situation as though covering theft fell under the same category as handing over gas money or helping with chores. It wasn't just unfair, it was entirely disconnected from reality. As the lectures dragged on, what struck me most was how completely the blame shifted. Jake barely came up in their scolding. Instead, I was the obstacle, the one holding him back, the heartless sibling failing her role. They didn't deny what he'd done, but they treated my refusal to fix it as the real crime. In their view, the actual theft had already been handled, and the only question left was whether I would show loyalty. They had inverted the hierarchy so thoroughly that saying no became the unforgivable act. It drained me, the hours of calls, the uninvited visits, the constant guilt layered over the shouting. It was a pressure campaign designed to wear me down. Their words carried a rhythm, a repetition meant to hammer the message in until it felt easier to surrender than resist. I could feel the impulse to cave rise in me, the familiar guilt looping in cycles. But every time it swelled, I pictured Dan's face in that meeting room, standing between management and the idea of police charges, and I knew I couldn't betray what he had already risked. He had given Jake the only lifeline left, and my parents had the nerve to demand more on top of it. By the end of those confrontations, it wasn't about Jake anymore. It was about whether I would obey, whether I would prove myself as the compliant daughter and sister they wanted me to be. Refusing marked me as disloyal. Every word, every plea, and every accusation led to that same cornering conclusion. If I didn't act, I wasn't family. And that's where the tension hung. Their anger sharpened, their appeals grew louder, and the pressure ratcheted up another notch. It no longer felt like conversations, it felt like build-up towards something more forceful, something designed to leave no space for choice at all. The Olympic-level ultimatum. The turning point came when my parents escalated their demands into what I can only describe as the Olympic-level ultimatum. After a solid week of calls, guilt, and reframing theft as a mistake, my father finally delivered it bluntly. If I didn't persuade Dan to rehire Jake, then I would be cut off from the family. Not financially, there's no trust fund in the picture. What he meant was complete exclusion. No Sunday dinners, no holiday invites, no calls. In his words, if Dan didn't bring Jake back, they couldn't keep pretending this family is whole. There was nothing ambiguous about it. Family membership itself was being treated like something they could revoke, a condition tied to whether my husband risked his career to employ their son again. The message was, comply or lose your seat at the table. They weaponized access to family in the same way you dangle a subscription renewal notice. Pay the loyalty fee and you're included. Refuse and your access ends. The absurdity was in how serious they were about it. They weren't yelling, but they didn't sound like people bluffing either. My mother added her part, insisting that I should beg Dan for another chance because this is what family does. The premise was simple: threaten exile if the terms weren't met. That threat was designed to feel heavy, the kind of sentence you're supposed to stop and reconsider. For a moment, I absorbed the weight of it. The idea of being told outright that my place in the family was conditional carried a sting, even though I had half expected things to reach this point. But the sting lasted longer for them than for me. Instead of scrambling to explain myself or promise to try, I told them I wasn't going to do it, then I hung up. And just like that, the line that had been buzzing nonstop all week fell quiet. That silence wasn't peace. It was the outcome of finally resisting what they always demanded from me. I didn't cave, so they left me on the outside. For the first time, I felt what it meant to not be the one rushing in to mediate, soothe, or fix. My parents thought the threat would break me, but all it really did was confirm how far they were willing to push. Refusing their ultimatum came with its own punch of clarity. If this was their definition of family, then I wasn't losing much by not signing on. All they were offering was continued access to a system where my job was to cover for Jake's failures. They dressed it as loyalty, but it was really about control. My marriage, Dan's career, my own sanity, none of it mattered as much to them as keeping Jake propped up. Of course, I knew their anger wouldn't end with that one phone call. The ultimatum wasn't the finale, it was just the official notice of how they would justify building pressure in new ways. They had declared their terms, and since I hadn't agreed, something else was coming, some next move in their campaign to make us bend. The ultimatum was ridiculous, but it also showed me something useful. My parents weren't worried about Jake's job anymore. They were worried about losing their leverage over me. By saying no and ending the call, I left them no option but to escalate in a different direction. And that's exactly what they did next, taking the conflict outside the family circle where it could be seen, heard, and picked apart by others. My brother was the first to step into that role. With the family standoff hanging in silence, he decided to speak for himself and frame the fallout in his own way. and in typical Jake fashion, he didn't do it quietly. Golden Child goes public. Jake's next move was putting his version of events on display, and he did it in the way so many people do now, vague, self-pitying posts on social media. He didn't write anything straightforward about being caught stealing, of course not. Instead, he tossed out lines about backstabbers, about being betrayed by the people who should stand by you, and about fake family. He filled his feed with words that made it sound like a Shakespearean tragedy, while leaving out the one fact that actually mattered, that he was fired for trying to slip company electronics into his bag. The audience for those posts wasn't his coworkers who already knew the truth. It was our extended family, his friends, and anyone online who didn't have the full story. He never named me outright, but the digs were pointed enough that everyone could connect the dots. In his narrative, I was the disloyal sister, the one who pulled strings to bring him down instead of lifting him up. And he cast himself as the talent cut short by a hostile world, unfairly stripped of opportunity just as he was turning things around. Watching it unfold, I couldn't help but feel a mix of irritation and disbelief. Here was a grown man who had been on camera stealing, reframing himself as a victim of betrayal. He acted as if being fired for misconduct was the same as being cast out of paradise. At one point, he even claimed that being abandoned by blood leaves scars forever. It was exaggerated, melodramatic, and completely detached from what actually happened. But if you didn't know the details, the performance came across as heartbreakingly sincere. My parents, unsurprisingly, embraced it all. They didn't approach those posts with skepticism, they treated them as if they were scripture. My mother quoted them back to me word for word, insisting that I had hurt him more deeply than I could imagine. My father echoed the same thoughts in his stern way, saying that Jake's heartache was proof enough that I had betrayed him. They didn't talk about the theft directly anymore. Instead, they pointed to his online words like they were irrefutable evidence of my cruelty. Every paragraph Jake typed became their ammunition. Anytime I tried to push back with facts, they'd pivot. But did you see what he wrote? He's in pain and you don't even care. His moody captions carried more weight in their minds than Dan's professional reputation or the decision that kept Jake from facing criminal charges. It was surreal. Social media angst had overnight become their new family ledger of truth. The damage didn't stop inside our household. Relatives who weren't close enough to know the details started chiming in. I got messages from cousins and even distant family friends asking what I had done to reject Jake, why I couldn't support him during his lowest point. Some even offered him words of encouragement in public comments, urging him to stay strong and cut out the snakes holding him back. They thought they were lifting up someone unfairly treated. In reality, they were cautioning his decision to twist the facts into a sob story. That was the danger of the whole thing. With control of the narrative, Jake turned something shameful into something sympathetic. He managed to take personal failure and rebrand it as public victimhood, and it worked. Strangers, relatives, even my parents latched onto his story because the version he presented was easier to swallow than the truth. Theft is ugly, betrayal feels noble. He knew which role to play, and he leaned into it completely. Living through that shift was infuriating. In the span of weeks, I had gone from the sister who refused to cover theft to the villain who abandoned her brother. Jake's story wasn't just infecting Facebook timelines, it was feeding into an already warped family dynamic where victimhood was handed to him before he ever earned responsibility. I wasn't just misrepresented, I was cornered. My reputation within my own extended family was rewritten without my consent. That realization landed hard. I could argue, I could push back with the truth of what happened, but I didn't have the same platform or sympathy. My brother had rewritten the script, my parents had accepted it without question, and now I was left in a position where denial made me look even colder. In their eyes, silence was guilt, protest was cruelty. There was no winning once that story had spread. The more those posts circulated, the more I realized this wasn't just about family discord anymore. It was making its way into spaces where it didn't belong, spaces where the consequences could stretch further than anyone expected. And while I was frustrated with being cast in the role of villain, I wasn't the one carrying the heaviest fallout from his little social media production. That landed squarely on someone else. Collateral damage, husband at work. When Jake's theatrics spilled onto social media, the chaos didn't just stay online or within the family. It crept into Dan's workplace in a way that was both unfair and humiliating. Because underneath all the drama, the reality was simple. An employee Dan personally recommended had been caught stealing from inventory. And while HR had already handled the termination, Dan couldn't just move on quietly. He had to sit down with his boss and explain himself. That meeting was as uncomfortable as you'd expect. Dan had built his career over more than 10 years at the company, developing a reputation as someone steady, detail-oriented, and above all, trustworthy. In the tech hardware business, especially with high-value equipment, trust is not negotiable. Now he had to apologize directly, admitting that the person he convinced management to take a chance on had been filmed trying to smuggle out graphics cards. There's no soft language that transforms theft into something minor. When you're looking your boss in the eye, trying to explain why your brother-in-law thought the inventory cage was a grab bag, there's no room to dance around the reality. The hardest part was knowing that Dan doesn't give recommendations lightly. He's cautious even about hiring acquaintances because he sees referrals as extensions of his professional name. For him to back Jake was rare, almost uncharacteristic, and he did it knowing it might create professional risk. So when Jake proved him wrong in less than a single quarter, it wasn't just workplace embarrassment, it was a personal blow. Somewhere in the back of Dan's mind was the worry that his boss would never view him the same, that his reliability had taken a hit because of one disastrous hire. It didn't matter that the fault lay squarely with Jake. Guilt has a way of attaching itself to the person who vouched first. Even more quietly significant was what didn't happen as a result of the theft. Management could have involved the police immediately. The equipment Jake tried to take wasn't cheap, and companies don't view missing stock as an excusable oversight. They had grounds for charges that would have followed him well past this job, but Dan persuaded them not to. He asked for the matter to stay internal, to treat termination as the full consequence. That choice wasn't automatic, it was a conscious act of shielding Jake from legal fallout. In doing so, Dan put both his judgment and his credibility to work on Jake's behalf one last time, even in the moment where Jake least deserved it. The irony isn't lost on me. The one person who protected Jake most directly was somehow the same person my parents accused of cruelty. He spared Jake from the consequences that could have defined the next decade of his life, yet they claimed he was too harsh for not reinstating him later. In reality, Dan had already extended the greatest lenience anyone in that company realistically could. He had given Jake a job based on trust, defended him once things fell apart, and chose an outcome that kept him out of court. That isn't severity, it's remarkable restraint. But restraint doesn't erase consequences at work. For weeks afterward, there were subtle signs of how much this weighed on him. Colleagues didn't mock him outright, but the topic hovered like smoke. Polite questions about how your relative is doing, or careful silence when staffing came up in meetings were reminders that everyone knew what had happened. In his role, image matters, and being linked to a nephew-like hire who treated the place like a shopping aisle felt like a shadow trailing into every department briefing. At home, I could see the fatigue creep in after each day. Every retelling, every indirect reference was another chance to relive how much he had staked and lost in a matter of weeks. And of course, there was the impossible contradiction he lived with. Most managers who deal with a bad hire can draw a line under it, it's done and the company moves on. Dan didn't have that option. He had to face respectful but awkward questions at work, then return home where my family led a campaign insisting he was the real villain. At the office, theft was a clear violation of trust. At the dinner table, firing a thief was framed as betrayal. That kind of contradiction wears on even the most even-tempered person, because no matter where he turned, someone demanded explanations. What stands out most is how he never retaliated. Even while Jake ranted online about backstabbers and loyalty, even while my parents shifted their fury directly onto us, Dan didn't spiral into anger or embarrassment. He stayed professional, gave what explanations he had to, and chose silence elsewhere. He didn't drag his side of the story onto social platforms or air his frustrations at family gatherings. His quiet was deliberate, not because he wasn't wounded, but because he believed patience and composure were how you preserve credibility when everything else is on fire. At home, I wrestled with how unfair this was. The man who offered Jake the only professional lifeline he'd ever had and spared him the wrath of the police when it fell apart was now being treated as the unfeeling enforcer. Meanwhile, Jake, who created the wreckage, was painted as the victim, and my parents poured their sympathy on him without hesitation. The story had been inverted so completely that the scapegoat was the person who actually showed loyalty, and the supposed casualty was the one who destroyed trust in the first place. The cruelty of that inversion is simple. The real sacrifice went unseen. If Dan had reacted like any other manager, Jake's file would now include criminal charges. Instead, the only evidence left was a professional blemish on Dan's judgment, which he quietly absorbed so Jake could walk away with nothing but unemployment. Yet that unseen sacrifice didn't earn him gratitude, it earned him blame. And as unfair as all of that already was, the story didn't end with awkward meetings or strained family visits. Because while most people would have taken the loss privately, my parents weren't content with blaming me or spouting vague loyalties online. They decided to escalate, and not in the way you'd expect from parents of a 30-year-old man who got himself fired. They carried their anger directly into Dan's workplace. Parents escalate to corporate complaints. Most people in a situation like this would cut their losses. They'd be embarrassed for their adult son, angry in private maybe, and then they'd move on. But my parents weren't satisfied with guilt-tripping me or cornering me in family lectures. They decided the real problem wasn't the theft itself, it was that Dan and his company overreacted by firing Jake. So my father, a grown man in his 60s, sat down and fired off an email to Dan's boss complaining about the decision, calling it unfair and demanding reconsideration. When Dan told me this had happened, I thought he was exaggerating, because who actually does that? It sounded like one of those helicopter parent parodies where someone emails a professor because their college-age child didn't get an A but no. This was my dad, typing up an official-looking grievance about how his 30-year-old son had been treated too harshly after getting caught smuggling expensive electronics out of a secure inventory cage. The complaint itself was exactly what you'd expect from parents who refuse to acknowledge reality. They brushed past the theft and painted Jake as a hardworking young man who had simply made a small mistake. They used words like fairness and opportunity as though they were pitching an inspirational biography instead of explaining why their son's backpack was full of graphics cards. The logic seemed to be, if you dress the story up in moral language, maybe a manager, whose job is literally to guard company assets, will suddenly ignore video evidence of theft. There's a kind of comedy in picturing that email sitting in a corporate inbox. The phrasing had the same tone as a bad Yelp review, indignant, self-important, and completely out of touch with the stakes. Unfair, too harsh, did not give our precious boy a second chance. That's how it read when Dan showed me later. They were appealing to a professional manager like he was a parenting referee, as though corporate HR decisions could be overwritten by parental lobbying. If there was any question of how seriously it landed, the boss answered that immediately. When he pulled Dan aside, he wasn't angry, he was bemused. He asked Dan if he was aware his father-in-law had sent a complaint, then with a kind of amused disbelief shared the gist of it. To him, it was less of a workplace dispute and more of a story you can't wait to tell over coffee. You'll never believe the message I got. That tone alone showed exactly how seriously they regarded it, not as a legitimate grievance but as a punchline. Still, professionalism mattered, so while the boss laughed, he also drew a line. He told Dan flatly that family members contacting the company wasn't acceptable, and he asked him to make sure it didn't happen again. In one sentence, he cut through all of it. This isn't how workplaces operate, and your father-in-law shouldn't be reaching out to management about a firing. That instruction turned their attempt at advocacy into what it really was, an embarrassing intrusion that didn't change the outcome one bit. For Dan, though, humor wasn't the whole story. He had worked for over a decade to build a reputation as steady and competent. Referrals, recommendations, team management, he took all of that seriously. Then suddenly his parents-in-law were behaving like helicopter guardians, barging into his professional sphere as though it were a family living room. He managed it calmly, but at home I could see the sting. Colleagues could laugh it off, supervisors could treat it as absurd, but for him it chipped away at the respect he valued. In his world, credibility is currency, and now his name was attached not just to the brother-in-law who got caught stealing, but to the in-laws who thought scolding his boss was a rational next step. That gap between what my parents believed they were doing and how it actually came across is what made it so surreal. In their minds, they were delivering a powerful appeal, proving their loyalty to their son. In reality, all they managed to do was add another layer of embarrassment onto an already humiliating situation. Instead of helping Jake, they made him the subject of workplace gossip, the guy whose parents couldn't let him handle his own consequences. For a 30-year-old, that's not advocacy. That's infantilization on full display. The escalation also reinforced something I had felt since childhood. My parents had always blurred boundaries, treating responsibility as something transferable, something that naturally landed on me if Jake faltered. But this was different. This wasn't them leaning on me in private. This was them barging into Dan's career, dragging his clean professional reputation into the chaos. And the fallout didn't touch Jake nearly as much as it touched us. They had tried to shift the weight off Jake once again, and instead, Dan became the one carrying the discomfort, the embarrassment, and the professional fallout. When I look back on it, the absurdity almost outweighs the anger. Parents intervening with a company on behalf of a 30-year-old man is so far out of bounds that even Dan's boss couldn't take it seriously. That, in the end, is their legacy, not that their complaint carried weight or shifted perspective, but that it cemented their reputation as people who would rather play savior than let their son stand up on his own. And in doing so, they didn't save him, they turned him into the punchline of a story told in a manager's office. If there's any lasting image from that chapter, it's Dan's expression when he recounted the boss's final words, "Please tell your father not to contact this company again." It was both a relief and a gut punch, a reminder that he had navigated the disaster with composure, but also that his in-laws had put him in an unthinkably awkward place to begin with. And even when that tactic failed, even when their email was brushed aside as absurd, the story didn't end there. Because once that door closed, my parents simply switched strategies and tried something else. The emotional tug-of-war. After their attempt to drag Dan's boss into the mess failed, my parents switched lanes. The anger and confrontational tone, especially from my mom, drained away, and what replaced it was something quieter but no less forceful. She pivoted to what I'd call the softer negotiation, pleading instead of demanding, framing it less like an ultimatum and more like a personal favor. She'd call me sounding calm, almost sympathetic, with lines like, "It doesn't have to be at Dan's company, just anywhere. Can't you find some job for him?" The request was worded as though it were a small, reasonable gesture. But underneath, it was the very same expectation. If Jake couldn't stay in one job, then I should be the one to secure him another. That softer approach carried more emotional force than the shouting ever did, because it left no space to accuse anyone of being combative. Instead, it draped guilt over me like a blanket. My mom painted elaborate pictures of Jake falling into hopelessness if no one stepped in, that he'd spiral without money, lose his confidence, and eventually unravel completely. Each projection was aimed like a spotlight back at me. If I didn't take action, I would be the one responsible for letting him collapse. She didn't accuse this time. She trembled, pleaded, and lowered her voice to deliver the kind of guilt that presses harder than direct anger ever could. But outside that emotional story, the reality hadn't changed. Jake wasn't unemployed because life was unkind. He was unemployed because he stole equipment he was trusted to safeguard. He didn't just stumble into misfortune, he orchestrated his own destruction. My husband had shielded him from what could easily have been police charges, and even then my parents treated the firing as a cruel mistake instead of what it was, the logical consequence of serious misconduct. It didn't matter how many times they reframed it. No company, large or small, would see caught stealing on camera and decide to hand someone another chance. It was over for reasons entirely of his own making. My mom's pleas weren't about acknowledging the truth, they were about coaxing me into giving up my boundaries so she didn't have to face it. It felt wearyingly familiar. Every pivot in their argument recycled an old script I had lived since childhood. Jake made chaos, I was expected to restore order. As kids, that meant I handed over allowance money after he wrecked my bike or gave up my afternoons tutoring him when he failed classes. As adults, the set pieces changed. Now it was jobs, housing, or bills, but the story always gave me the same role, cleanup crew. Each time the ask was dressed up as light or temporary, "Can't you just help him once more?" Then weeks later, I'd be stuck with all the responsibility while Jake got to shrug his way forward. This scaled-down version of their request, "Just find him something," fit the same pattern. On the surface, it sounded like helping him fill out applications or pointing him to job boards. In practice, I'd learned exactly how it went. After a few half-hearted attempts from him, the burden would land squarely on me. I'd be the one fielding calls, writing cover letters, or smoothing over interviews. It started as a small favor and escalated into months of unpaid, unrecognized labor. That's why I pushed back swiftly this time. I knew every step of the pattern, and I wasn't prepared to walk it again. But standing firm required more than just saying no on the phone, so I put my boundaries into writing. I drafted an email to both of my parents, calmly and clearly restating what I had already said, that I wouldn't intervene again, that Jake needed to pursue his own work, and that my household wasn't going to absorb the consequences of his choices any longer. I softened the edges where I could, but I made sure there was no room for interpretation. This wasn't anger, it wasn't lashing out, it was clarity. I sent it, received the read receipt, and finally felt some certainty that my words couldn't be twisted or ignored. In the moment, sending that message gave me a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because for the first time, my position was documented plainly and couldn't be brushed aside with claims that I hadn't explained myself. Dread because I knew it would ignite another round of responses that tried to paint me as cold or unfeeling. But at least, for once, the record showed exactly where I stood. The tug-of-war they staged, using emotion against reason, wore me out more than the yelling had. One side was my mom's voice, breaking as she urged me to please just try, as though Jake's survival depended on my willingness to search job boards. The other side was the unshakable math I couldn't ignore. Stealing from your workplace removes chances, not creates them. Every part of me wanted to avoid hurting her feelings, but I couldn't pretend I didn't see the cycle repeating itself. Helping hadn't ever stopped him from failing. It had only delayed the reckoning. Even my father, though less dramatic, chimed in enough to support her. He framed it bluntly instead of tearfully. I was selfish if I stood back and let Jake sink. Their tones were different, but the conclusion was the same. According to them, holding steady meant turning my back on family, while stepping in meant proving my loyalty. It wasn't a reasoned debate, it was emotion stretched across both anger and sorrow to pin me into a corner. The The situation itself would have been heartbreaking if it weren't also so routine. My brother wrecked his chance, and instead of confronting that, my parents reshaped the roles again. Jake is the wounded, fragile child, me as the powerful sister with the ability to rescue him if I only cared enough. Sitting through those conversations, I couldn't help noticing how absurd it all had become. Theft at work, actual theft, was being packaged like another accident I was supposed to fix. What stung more than the ask itself was realizing how deep my parents' denial ran. By never allowing Jake to live inside the consequences of his choices, they exhausted themselves fighting shadows. They pleaded, bargained, and reframed to preserve the idea that he was unlucky rather than reckless. But no matter how many ways they spun it, the result didn't change. He still had no job, and this time no recommendation from anyone. It hit me then that the tug of war wasn't about Jake's future at all. It was about avoiding their own discomfort with letting him fail. As much as I wanted to ease their voices by giving in to something small, I knew how the story would end if I did. It would snowball, I'd bear the work, and Jake would still end up in the same spot. Saying no was the only way to cut the cord on the game. This time I refused to be the automatic cleanup crew. That choice upset them, but it also forced the truth out where it belonged. Jake's path was his to manage, not mine to arrange. And even though that refusal carried plenty of heat, it also felt like clarity. I was no longer just enduring another episode in an endless pattern, I was breaking it. It didn't resolve the family fracture, but it positioned the responsibility where it needed to stay. And that reality tied directly back to what the entire story showed me about the difference between enabling someone and actually helping them. Looking back, two things stand out the clearest. First, every time my parents insisted on softening the impact for Jake, they weren't protecting him, they were preserving the same cycle that has followed him since childhood. Shielding him only taught him that someone else would always bear the weight of his choices. Second, drawing boundaries wasn't cruelty. Protecting my marriage, guarding my mental health, even starting therapy to pull myself out of the fixer role, those steps were necessary, not selfish. So I'll leave it with you. Have you ever been cast as your family's problem solver? Share your story below and leave one piece of advice you wish someone had told you sooner. In the end, boundary isn't betrayal, it's survival.